Sidney Sanders McMath was the 34th governor of Arkansas, serving from 1949 to 1953. His years in the governor's office were times of remarkable change for the state. He built a modern highway system, brought electricity to rural Arkansas, fought for civil rights and education for all Arkansans. In reality, Sid McMath had three careers: politician, distinguished lawyer, and member of the United States Marine Corps. Join us now as we look back at the career of Governor Sidney McMath.
I was born June the 14th, and of course that's the day when Uncle Sam unfurls the flags, you know, and run the Old Glory up to the top of the flagpole. So it's a good date to remember, and I've always been happy about the association of my birthday with the flag. But I was born in Columbia County in Big Creek Bottom on the old McMath home place. And my sister and I were born there. She's 2 years older than I am, and we were born on the same day, but 2 years different. But I had some fond memories of that period in my life. I picked cotton on the farm up to about, let's say I was 7 or 8 or 9 years of age, I guess, when I was picking cotton. And I was a good cotton picker. I could pick 100 pounds a day, you know, and I got $1 a pound. So I'd get a cent a pound, not $1 a pound. I'd make $1 a day.
$1 a day.
I decided I'd go down to a country store about 2 miles from where we lived, and I took some of my money with me, and I was going to make some purchases. So I went down, and of course, you've been in these country stores, you know, general stores, and they have everything,
right,
you know.
Yeah.
So I went in and I looked over everything real good, and I remember pretty well what I purchased. The first thing I bought was a dog collar for my dog. I had a dog, his name was Bulger, and we were real good companions. So I brought him a dog collar. I got a big Florida orange, and I got a great big red apple, and I got a Florida orange for my sister, and a big apple for my sister. And I bought some chocolate drops for my mother. She loved chocolate drops. So I went home with those prized possessions.
It's amazing, your first time to do any purchasing on your own.
On my cotton money, cotton picking money, yeah. Well, of course, I had a chance to get to see how people lived at that time.
That's right.
David, you know, we were really, they talk about depression, the 28, 9 along in there in the 30s. We had a depression all the time in that part of South Arkansas, and generally in the South, particularly in the rural areas, because we still hadn't recovered from the Civil War really well.
If I'm not mistaken, your father was, and your family, you were moving around so he could make a better living. You moved to Smackover and over in Union County and a couple of other communities, and maybe even back down to Columbia County, and then on to Hot Springs.
That's right, that's right. He was, my dad really didn't like farming, but he liked horses. And he liked to deal in cattle. So he would trade and traffic in horses and cows.
When Sid was 11, Hal McMath moved the family to Hot Springs, a resort town known for medicinal baths and open gambling. Sid sold newspapers in the downtown streets and in the midst of the casinos. But in school and the Boy Scouts, he met role models that helped shape his future. Young Sid had three ambitions: to be a lawyer, to be a Marine, and to be a politician.
One of the greatest things that happened to me in my life was our move to Hot Springs. They had excellent schools, and in Hot Springs was a cosmopolitan place. You met people in all different races and backgrounds and so forth, and people came there from all over the world. And I went to high school there. I thought about running for governor when I was in high school. And I was president of my freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior classes. There was a chief of police and National Park Police in Hot Springs named Richard L. Gaffney. And he had a scout troop that I was a member of, the 3rd Boy Scout troop in Hot Springs, and he had a boys club. And he was an unofficial recruiter for the Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps was involved in Nicaragua at the time. And he had all these recruiting posters about the Marine Corps, see, and so forth. So I got the idea I wanted to be a Marine. And he gave me these posters, and I painted my room with them. Oh. Well, he thought it would be a good idea if I went to the Naval Academy, which I'd be fine. So Congressman D.D. Glover, a great man, wonderful man from Malvern, wonderful family, gave me an appointment to the Naval Academy. So I went down to Henderson to kind of prep out on it, and there was a wonderful lady down there who tried to help me with my math. You see, when I was in high school, when I got involved in dramatics, I neglected my science and my math, see. So it caught up with me.
Right.
See. So when I took my examination for the Naval Academy, I flunked it. I flunked it.
Because of the math.
Yeah.
The lack of math, I guess.
The lack of math, yeah. So I saddled up and went to University of Arkansas, and I signed up with the Reserve Officers Training Corps, you know, for the 4-year tour, and then I took my pre-law. And so I was involved in dramatics and the military and getting ready to go to law school at the University of Arkansas.
Sid arrived in Fayetteville with only a few dollars to his name. He worked odd jobs to support himself and took up boxing. As a senior, he was elected president of the Student Senate. He became captain of his ROTC squad. He went on to finish his law degree in Fayetteville and complete his military training in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, at the same time hitchhiking back and forth. He received a commission with the Marine Corps and spent a year as a recruiter in Pennsylvania before returning to Hot Springs to open a law practice and marry his high school sweetheart.
I came home to marry Elaine Broughton.
Yes.
And at that time in the Marine Corps, the policy was that if you were a second lieutenant, you couldn't get married. You had to be in the Marine Corps 2 years before you get married. And the policy was that if the Marine Corps wanted you to have a bride, they'd issue you one. See? So I went home to marry Elaine and to practice law. But that was in the 37, and my paint on my shingle hadn't gotten dry until, of course, these war clouds gathered, and I felt an obligation to go back in.
But you actually went back in the Marines a year before Pearl Harbor,
that's right.
1940.
I went back in August 1940, and when I was getting out of the Corps in 1937, Captain Louis Chesty Puller, one of the most famous Marines ever, highly decorated, came by my quarters to see me. And he says, Sandy, he called Scotchman Sandy, he said, I can understand you going home to marry your sweetheart and to practice law. But let me tell you something. He says, you need to take a reserve commission because we're going to war. Now that was 1937, and he foresaw the war against Japan.
And he even thought it to be and predicted it to be Japan?
That's right, that's right. He thought it was Japan, and the Marine Corps was getting psychologically prepared for a war against Japan, see, at that time. Of course, the Marine Corps was a small organization, only had about 17,000 Marines. At the end of the war, they had 5 divisions, you know. I went back in August of 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor.
In the war, in World War II, I've heard you speak of this often, and I know that you feel very strongly about it. Tell us about Bauxite, Arkansas, in Saline County, very briefly, and its contribution to the World War II war effort, if you would.
David,
very few people know about
I appreciate you asking me that question. When you're talking about history, this is a dramatic chapter in the history of Arkansas and the history of the country that nobody knows anything about. The average person doesn't know anything about it. You know, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt announced to the world, we're going to build 100,000 airplanes. Well, you have to have aluminum to build airplanes. And the experts didn't think he could do it, that we could do it. Hitler didn't think we could do it, because at that time, the bauxite that we were using was coming from South America. And the Nazi naval blockade had sunk these ships bringing up bauxite, so had blockaded the South Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, and so we weren't getting that source of bauxite. And Alcor had a very conservative policy of conserving their resources for their future, see? So they were using this South American bauxite. Well, Roosevelt knew something that the experts didn't know, and that Hitler didn't know. He knew about Bauxite, Arkansas. 95% of the bauxite in North America was in Bauxite, Arkansas. And he knew about the people that would be called on to go in and dig it out. And the people in Bauxite in central Arkansas went in and worked around the clock to dig out that bauxite. And aluminum was produced, and planes were built, and battles were fought, and victories won.
McMath went back into the Marine Corps in 1940, training officers at the Marine Training School in Quantico, Virginia. Elaine joined him, and in 1942, their son Sandy was born. But Elaine never recovered from complications from the birth. She died at Quantico a few months after Sandy was born. Sandy was sent back to Hot Springs to stay with Elaine's parents, and McMath requested overseas duty. McMath was assigned to the 3rd Marine Regiment and joined other divisions in the Pacific in the war against Japan.
The Marines landed in the Solomons in August of 1942, the 1st Marine Division, and we were to join the 1st Marine Division, but en route we were diverted to American Samoa. You know, that was a base of really operations in that part of the world, and to protect it against the Japanese who were moving south towards New Zealand and Australia. So as soon as I got ashore, I said, well, I'm sure going to get a company or a battalion or something. I was a major at the time. And they gave me word as I was going to be the training officer in the jungle warfare school.
Well, that was important.
Yeah. So we set up a jungle warfare school and put the non-commissioned officers and the junior officers of the 3rd Marine Regiment through a jungle warfare school, see? And then, of course, after that, I was made operations officer for the 3rd Marine Regiment, and that's where we were. I was in Guadalcanal, but I was not in Guadalcanal in the first phases of it. Guadalcanal was pretty well secured time we got there. We used Guadalcanal as a base to go on up to New Georgia and Vella La Vella, Colomangallo, and Bougainville.
McMath contracted malaria and returned to Marine headquarters in Washington for the remainder of the war. A friend introduced him to Ann Phillips, a secretary for the House of Representatives. They dated throughout most of 1944 and were married that October. Once the war was over, Sid took Ann back home to Hot Springs, where their son Philip was born. Sid went back to practicing law and found Garland County in the controls of a political machine run by Hot Springs Mayor Leo McLaughlin.
He had two horses named Scotch and Soda, and he'd hitch them up to a buggy and ride down through Central Avenue to be admired by his vassals and so forth, see. He was an excellent speaker. He could really rouse a mob, you know. The situation in Hot Springs from a political standpoint was sad, was tragic. We had illegal gambling in Hot Springs, and it wasn't just the gambling per se that was so bad, really evil, but in order to operate illegally, the machine had to control the election machinery, appoint the judges and clerks, have the election commission, and so forth, and so that they can control all law enforcement officials. The mayor, the prosecuting attorney, the circuit judge, the sheriffs up and down the line, see? And they selected the grand jurors, and they selected the petty jurors. And if you had a lawsuit over in municipal court, see, you had to be on the right side if you were going to get anything like justice, because they selected the juror, and jurors came from people downtown, the casinos, the bookies, the houses of ill fame, and so forth. So there were other GIs who had come back, and we weren't intimidated, and so to speak, and we felt that we'd been fighting for freedom around the world, and we should use a little of it at home.
McMath and other local veterans formed the Government Improvement League, known as the GIs. 1946 was an election year, and the GIs set out to clean up Garland County. McMath ran for prosecuting attorney.
Having fought the war for the preservation of democratic principles, should we not demand that our own local government be purged of political dictatorship? If I have not heretofore made it clear, I wish to announce to you that I stand opposed to the mayor of Hot Springs and to all of his political methods.
There was a good citizen by the name of Earl Ricks, and another citizen by the name of Raymond Clinton, the uncle of the president. They had a Clinton-Ricks Buick agency, and they had a huge garage, and so we held our meetings in the Ricks-Clinton garage. We had a candidate for every spot, from constable on up to circuit judge, had a GI candidate. And we ran in the primary. I was the only one elected in the primary. We organized an independent party, and all the candidates, GI candidates who had been defeated, ran as independents for the offices that they had run for in the primary.
You didn't have really a Republican Party
No,
at that
it had
time.
no Republican Party.
The GIs challenged McLaughlin in the courtroom. The election laws of the time required people to pay a poll tax in order to vote. McLaughlin's forces were using illegal poll tax receipts to cast votes for their own candidates.
Of course, we avoided those illegal poll taxes. We brought suit in the United States federal court, and we were able to get the issue in federal court because I had a friend in Pine Bluff named Pat Mullis, who volunteered to run as an independent, file as an independent, see? And it gave the federal court jurisdiction over the issue because a federal officer or congressman was going to be voted on. And so we threw out 3,000 or 4,000 of the illegal poll taxes, and of course we swept the field in the general election, elected everybody, see?
The overthrow of the McLaughlin machine became known as the GI Revolt. As prosecuting attorney, McMath began closing down Hot Springs' illegal gambling operations. In 1948, incumbent Governor Ben Laney announced he would not seek a third term, and McMath entered the race, running on his war record, the GI Revolution, and a promise to modernize an underdeveloped state.
I can't recall a campaign when it wasn't talked about. But I can recall that we haven't done anything about it. And that's our roads and highway system in Arkansas. And I hope when you go to the polls, you'll vote for Sid McMath for governor. And working together, we will have a better Arkansas.
His campaign was managed by his old friend, Henry Woods.
Henry and I have been friends seemingly forever. His mother and my mother were friends. And we both graduated from Hot Springs High School. Of course, I was ahead of Henry probably about 4 years. And Henry, at that time, was practicing law in Texarkana, and he was president of the Young Democrats. And he came over to see me and about any way he could help me in the campaign. And I said, well, I'd like you to be my campaign manager. Of course, being the president of the Young Democrats, it was a natural to have these organizations, and they were a live wire organization back then. They were well organized and active, probably more so than the Democratic Party. And so I said, would you be my campaign manager? He says, well, how much money do you have? I said, well, I got $1,500 cash, and I got $1,500 promised. He says, we can win, I'll take the job.
That's the power of positive.
Can you imagine starting off a major campaign with $1,500 cash?
My goodness,
$1,500 promise?
That wouldn't pay your filing fee today. That wouldn't pay for one 30-second TV.
But Henry stayed with me in every campaign I've ever been in, and he was my right-hand man when I was governor.
McMath faced former Attorney General Jack Holt and radio evangelist James McMcCrell in the Democratic primary. The Democratic Party dominated the South at that time, and McMath's win guaranteed victory in the fall general elections. Race became an issue in the national elections of 1948. Democrat Harry Truman was running for president with civil rights as part of his platform. Outgoing Arkansas Governor Ben Laney and other Southern Democrats rebelled against the party, and they split to form their own faction, the Dixiecrats. It was an effort to kill Truman's chances and to send a message that the South would not support a president who believed in civil rights.
Truman, at that time, was unpopular, principally because of a civil rights program. And the Dixiecrats, they were unhappy about the platform and so forth, so they withdrew from the convention, and I think went to either Montgomery, Alabama, or Jackson, Mississippi. I don't remember exactly which one it was, and nominated Strom Thurmond as president and Fielding Wright as vice president. And Governor Laney chaired that Dixiecrat meeting.
Arkansas was one of the very few southern states that remained loyal to the National Democratic ticket. Now, why was that?
As soon as I was nominated in '48, one of the things that I did immediately, 2 or 3 things that I took on, but I feel that the most important thing I did was start campaigning for President Truman. Mm-hmm. All the polls indicated that Truman would be defeated, and no one thought he would win except Harry Truman. And we were able to carry Arkansas by a real good vote, majority vote.
Although the Dixiecrats did win 4 states, Truman went on to defeat Republican Thomas Dewey for president. Arkansas had been a key southern state in Truman's victory, and he was grateful to Sid McMath for his support.
Arkansas stayed in the Democratic Party, and President Truman appreciated that, and he came to Arkansas several times.
There's a fabulous picture of you and President Truman walking down Main Street.
You know, that was the 35th Division reunion, his old Army outfit. You know, Truman was a captain in the First World War, you know. It was a National Guard outfit. And so he always went to their conventions, and he always marched with the troops, you know. And so on this occasion, he came to Arkansas, and we marched down Main Street, as you indicated, in front of the troops. And we got down to Markham. We turned west or left on Markham and went up to the Old Marion Hotel.
Well, I want to ask you about that. They say that you had a private audience with President Truman. Can you tell on the television about what you and President Truman did or talked about?
I think so, and I think we can tell about it.
You were in the Marion Hotel.
Marion Hotel in the presidential suite. In the presidential suite. And you didn't have all the entourage around the president that you have now, so we had a quiet visit. It was in July, or it was in the summer, I think it was July. We went into his suite, and he says, "Governor, how would you like to have a drink?" I wasn't about to turn him down.
Right, President of the United States.
I said, "Fine, Mr. President." He said, "Well, how about bourbon and branch water?" Great. He said, "Well, you're going to be waited on by the highest paid bartender in the world."
That is great.
Well, I looked around, there wasn't anybody, just two of us.
So Harry Truman poured you a drink.
He got behind the bar, and he took all those lowball glasses, and he poured half a bourbon and half a water.
Yeah.
And we sat down and visited for 45 minutes an hour, talked. He talked, I listened.
McMath took office in January 1949, and he immediately launched his modernization plans and made good on his promise to get Arkansas out of the mud. 8 Arkansas counties didn't have a single mile of paved roads at the time.
I never saw a paved road until I went to Hot Springs. If you can believe that, when I was 10 years of age.
First
I'd seen a paved street. I'd seen sidewalks. And my sister and I were taking the streetcar from out to South Whittington, where we lived, or West Whittington, where we lived, and we had to change streetcars at the junction, the Park Avenue and Whittington Junction. And while we were waiting, my sister used to tell this on me and just get the biggest kick out of it. She said, I went out in the middle of the street and tapped on the pavement, and I said, "Look here, sister, here's a pavement out in the middle of the street."
A pavement in the middle of the street.
Yeah. So we didn't have any hard surface roads, and of course Arkansas at that time, we'd just been through the war, and most things had been neglected, particularly the roads. And we didn't have roads the farmers didn't have roads to get their produce to market, to get the children to school, and we were losing population in the rural areas. And so we came up with a bond issue, and we were able to sell the bonds and get a road program going, and we divided the money equally between the rural to market roads and the primary highway.
Well, Governor, if I'm not mistaken, you built probably more miles of paved roads than any other governor in history.
Well,
and you did this in a 4-year period, and you did it with a bond issue.
Right.
And it's really amazing.
Yeah. And now, those bonds were paid off.
They were paid off.
With I think a 2-cent tax on gasoline.
Sid McMath was a dynamic young governor, and the nation took notice. He passed a bill to double school funding and consolidated the state schools from over 1,500 districts to 424. He set out to construct a modern medical school for Arkansas.
Lewis Webster Jones was president of the University of Arkansas, and he and several other people came to me and talked to me about the medical center and the need for a medical school, among other things, to train doctors, to encourage to go into rural areas and so forth. So we put our heads together and came up with a tax of 2 cents on each package of cigarettes. And that was 1949. And you can see what's happened since then, what an excellent source of revenue for a tax. Half of the patients at the hospital at the time were being treated for a tobacco-related disease, emphysema or lung cancer or whatnot. And so that passed, and we were able to build a medical center.
In 1949, Ann gave birth to their third son, Bruce. During the first year in office, Sid, Ann, and the boys lived in a house on Ridgeway Street in Little Rock. But in early 1950, they became the first Arkansas family to live in the new governor's mansion. It was the first time an Arkansas governor and his family had an official residence, and it was a showplace. Soon after, one new mansion resident caused a stir.
They were having a road opening dedication, and they invited me up to cut the ribbon. And so I cut the ribbon, and those old coon hunters up there knew that I was a coon hunter. See, my boys and I hunted coons down on the farm and so forth. And so they made a great ceremony out of giving me Old Red. And so I took Old Red home with me, and he was there at the mansion, and we were feeding him out of the governor's fund, expense fund, and so forth. And there was a newspaper reporter in North Little Rock took up the issue and accused me of misusing the governor's funds, operating funds, to feed my dog, feeding him, so forth and so forth. Well, my response was that Old Red had replaced one state trooper as a guard at the mansion. And since he was working for the state, I thought it was only fair that he be fed by the state. That's right.
What a fair compromise.
Yes, sir.
While the governor and his family enjoyed a beautiful new home full of modern conveniences, most citizens of Arkansas weren't so lucky. Half of the population of Arkansas had no electricity. Sid McMath knew this was the key to improving farm life and drawing industry to the state. In 1935, President Roosevelt had set up the Rural Electrification Administration, better known as the REA, to help rural electric co-ops bring power to the countryside. By supporting the publicly owned co-ops, McMath made a political enemy of the privately owned Arkansas Power and Light Company.
That was a passion with me, to get electricity to the farms. Where I lived on the farm in South Arkansas, we had no electricity. You know, a washing machine was a black pot in the backyard, and a dryer was a clothesline, you know, and it had a tub with a scrub board, you know, and we had no indoor plumbing, you know, and so I recognized the quality of life that could be experienced by the people in rural areas if they just had electricity, see? And it certainly lifted the burden of women on the farm. So, and when I was running in 1948, two people came to see me in Hot Springs. It was Tom Fitzhugh, who was attorney for the Rural Electric Co-ops, and Harry Oswald. Bless his heart, that pioneer, that champion of the...
What a man.
He did a tremendous job. They came to me and talked about that program and what they wanted to do. And they wanted to extend it out into rural areas, and they couldn't get the power interests to do it. The Arkansas Power and Light Company was totally owned by the Mid-South Utilities. And although they told us that was just a little old Arkansas company, it was owned by Middle-South Utilities. They owned all the common stock. And they were opposed to the power company extending lines out in the rural areas because it was not profitable at that time. But they foresaw that someday it would be highly profitable, which has happened, you know. So they were opposed to the co-ops extending out into this rural area beyond the area that they already had. And I had this and they wanted to build their own steam generating plant. Build their own steam generating plant and their own generating lines to get power up in the northern part of Arkansas. See? And they had to get a loan under the REA program from the federal government.
McMath intervened on behalf of the co-ops and made a call to President Truman. The REA program loaned the co-ops $10 million to build the plant at Ozark, and the Arkansas Power and Light Company fought the co-ops all the way to the Arkansas Supreme Court.
Then the power company went to a judge and got a restraining order, which was affirmed by the Supreme Court of Arkansas, saying that the REA in its original act, back in about 36, way back there, did not authorize the cooperatives to build their own generating system. And of course, our argument was that they authorized them to build transmission lines, and if they were authorized to build transmission lines, by implication, they could build a steam generating plant to furnish the power to go over the transmission lines to their customers. But the Supreme Court didn't see it that way, and they ruled against us.
Despite the court ruling, McMath continued his support of the Arkansas Electric Co-ops and became the first Arkansas governor to attend a rural electrification state meeting.
You know, the people were pretty well convinced that now this co-op business going in and borrowing money from the government to come in and compete with the private power companies is socialistic.
It's socialism.
Socialism,
that's
see?
what they called it.
So I was invited to go up to Fayetteville to talk to a co-op meeting. And I flew up there in a one-engine airplane, and we had to land at a turkey pasture. And so we had to make 2 passes to shoo the turkeys off. To the turkey, yeah. And so I had my statement for the press and the committee already. You know, I'd thought about it. And I just sure there'd be a big crowd out there, you know, to meet me at the airfield. Got out of the airplane, walked to the gate, wasn't anybody there. Nobody. Yeah. It was a hot July day.
How'd you get to town? How'd you get into
Well, I took my coat off and I started walking down a dusty road, another road that I paved. And a farmer came along in a truck. He stopped, he said, "Where you going?" I said, "I'm going to the co-op meeting." He said,
"And you were the governor of Arkansas?"
Yeah, I was the governor of Arkansas. He said, "Gideon, that's where I'm going." Well, we visited and so forth, but I didn't tell him I was governor. He must have, I assumed he knew it. My name had been in the paper and pictured and so forth. And so we went to the co-op meeting in a great big tent. You know, they used to have a great big tent. And the time came for me to talk. I was a speaker. And Russ Gates was the manager of the co-op, and he introduced me. He gave me a flowery introduction. He says, "I give you Sid McMath, the governor of Arkansas." Well, this old farmer that had brought me to town was sitting on the front row there. And he leaned to his neighbor and he said in a loud voice, he said, "That ain't no governor, he's a hitchhiker." I know, because I brung him to town.
He thought you were an imposter, didn't he? McMath's progressive momentum carried him through the 1950 election. He beat former Governor Ben Laney by almost 2-1. At the state Democratic Convention, McMath challenged party rules that said only whites could vote in the primary election. He was set to run for a 3rd term, but a 1951 highway audit led to accusations that his administration was accepting money in return for construction and equipment contracts.
When I ran for a 3rd term, I shouldn't have run. I should not have made that race. See, the power aligned against me was just overwhelming. See, they had
Well, you'd taken on a lot of groups.
Oh man, yeah. You know that.
Powerful
of course,
group.
they had the highway audit thing. See, and that was spectacular and used, and they held it until the beginning of the race in 1952 in the spring, started releasing all these charges about my administration and highway.
And let me say this: ultimately, no wrongdoings were found, and I wanted to.
Three grand juries went through this business. The chairman of the Highway Audit Commission was a member of the board of directors of the Arkansas Power and Light Company. On each of the grand juries, there were either members of the Arkansas Power and Light, the board of directors, or representatives of so there was, and then in the second grand jury, they had private funds to hire a private prosecutor to see that, you know, everything was covered. And then no opportunities to get an indictment were passed over. Well, after 3 grand juries in succession, they came up with 2 indictments of highway employees. And the first indictment was not thrown out by the trial judge for lack of evidence. And the second trial went to the jury, and the jury was out 4 minutes and returned a verdict of not guilty for that particular defendant. And all that was the result of all the highway audit.
But your attention and your focus and your resources of energy were focused on this episode.
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
you were consumed with this.
And of course, you know, it's hard to defeat an allegation.
McMath faced 4 opponents in the Democratic primary of 1952, including Judge Francis Cherry of Jonesboro. Judge Cherry took his campaign to the airwaves using a gimmick known as the talkathon, paid political broadcast that went on for hours. The talkathon and the highway audit were too much for Sidney McMath.
The president of the Arkansas Power and Light Company, who was against me at that time, naturally, he came up with this talkathon because a candidate in Florida had used it and had won. It was a natural for Francis. So he prevailed on Francis to use it. I led the ticket in the July primary, and so Francis and I went in the runoff, and our senior senator and the president of Arkansas Power and Light Company gathered in Jonesboro and endorsed Francis. And so I was defeated, and as I say, I shouldn't have made the race.
When his term was up in January of 1953, the McMaths moved out of Little Rock to a home in Grant County and gave birth to twins Melissa and Patricia later that year. McMath went back into law practice with Henry Woods and Leland Leatherman. Through the firm, McMath continued his work with the electric co-ops.
In 1953, I guess, or 54, we introduced a bill in the legislature to permit the co-ops to build a steam generating plant, and the power company had a lot of influence in the legislature, defeated it. And then the next year, I think it was 54, we got another bill and got it passed. So the co-ops got the loan to build a steam generating plant at Ozark, Arkansas, and then they were off to supply electricity to the rural areas that hadn't been getting the electricity.
Well, you didn't stay out of politics very long. You still had that. You were still that fire horse, and you still had that passion, and you wanted to do something. So the next thing you did is 2 years later, you ran not for governor again, but you challenged John L. McClellan, Senator John L. McClellan, in 1954, and this was kind of at the peak or of the Joe McCarthy era. And you took on John L. McClellan. Talk about that race a little bit.
Well, first place, John McClellan and I had been good friends. I had campaigned for him when he was first elected for Congress, see? And but we got crosswise because of the power issue, you know. And he was against President Truman's program, see? So I ran against him in 1954 and was defeated.
You almost defeated John McClellan in 1954. That was a razor edge, razor close, I should say, race. A lot of people say that in certain counties you were counted out, and I don't know that to be the case. I don't know whether that's true or false, but you surely almost won that race.
Well, you know, it looks like sour grapes and a poor loser if you say, well, I was counted out, you know, we cheated and so forth, but there were 2 or 3 counties in eastern Arkansas where people that I had relied on in the past had been for me, they went the other way at the last minute and made a difference in the late.
That's right. While McMath was challenging Senator John McClellan for his Senate seat, a former member of his administration was running for governor, and his name was Orval Eugene Faubus.
Orval and I met in Fayetteville. I was running for governor for the first time in 1948. And we rode from Fayetteville over to Huntsville, his hometown, in a car and visited. And he was interested in feeling me out and finding out what my platform was. And
now, at that time, he was not the postmaster yet, or what was he at that time?
I don't know whether he was postmaster or had been, or whether he was a county clerk or something.
Right.
But anyway, he was trying to make up his mind who he was going to support in that election. And by the time we got to Huntsville, he decided he'd support me. So he supported me and did a good job for me, because he had a close contact with the rural people in northern Arkansas, particularly.
He could speak their language.
Speak their language, and he understood their needs. He was one of them. And so when I was elected governor, Orval says, Sid, I'd like to have a paying job. So he came down and he went to work for me as a secretary, and his job was to meet with these county committees coming down to try to get the road paved, see? And he knew their needs and understood them and so forth. He was very good, and he was very helpful in that area.
McMath lost the 1954 Senate race, but Faubus was elected governor. McMath continued to champion civil rights, fighting for the abolition of the poll tax in 1956. His relationship with Orval Faubus changed dramatically in 1957.
We were okay until 1957, and we had the Little Rock High School crisis. And I call it a crisis because that's what it was. And I did not feel that we made the right decision on calling out the guard to keep those children from entering the high school. I felt that leadership at that time, moving in the right direction, could have resolved the matter before it got out of hand. We had been making a lot of progress in the racial relationship and getting educational opportunities for blacks.
He is in the governor's office and he calls the guard out, and you strongly disagree with him in public. And evidently you go on television and you characterize this as a very wrong direction for us to be taking at this time. He fires back at you, who you are his own mentor, you're his former boss. He worked for you. As you said, you paved that Highway 23 that we affectionately call the Pig Trail and let Faubus out of the hills. One of your great mistakes. But personally, you and Governor Forrest, I guess that time, had a split, and it really never healed to any extent, I guess.
Well, I say it was a mistake in the light of the progress we were making and so forth, to call out the troops, to block the court order, to keep these children out of the school. I also thought it was ill-advised for President Eisenhower to send the 101st Airborne, see? Because it just gave the wrong impression and so forth, and it's an invasion of the Yankees again and so forth. And I talked to Vice President Nixon and asked him if he could dissuade the president from using the 101st Airborne. But when they used the 101st Airborne, well, people who were really not for Faubus rallied, well, we've been invaded. See, and so that gave him the political power that he needed to be in office.
McMath decided to challenge Faubus in 1962.
His name is Sid McMath, a lawyer by trade, a hunter when he can be. This summer, he's a candidate for governor on the Democratic ticket. He's a man with one thing on his mind, the future of Arkansas.
We're going to have to turn around now and face the future.
I gave that a lot of consideration. Of course, in the main, I'd be running against people who had been my supporters, see, against an organization that I'd helped build. And I understood the difficulties. And it, again, that may have been a mistake to make that race because of the formidable opposition and the issue that was so paramount in people's minds. But I wanted to make a statement. And I made that race in order to make a statement that I thought that leadership was going in the wrong direction at the wrong time. And I made that statement, and I was defeated. And that was the reason I made it, and I did the best I could. I ran as hard a race as I could, but didn't have enough votes in the ballot box.
Well, you sure were up against a massive amount of firepower with Orval Faubus at that time, because he was probably at the peak of his power. By 1962, he had gotten through the integration crisis and all that business, but he had built an enormous power base, probably unlike any other governor we've ever had.
Right. If it's any consolation, I have a feeling that at least I've been vindicated by history.
The 1962 race for governor was the last he made for political office. He then refocused his energy on the military and the law and became one of Arkansas's most distinguished trial lawyers. His partnership with Leland Leatherman and Henry Woods lasted for 25 years until Woods went to the bench as a United States District Judge. Sidney McMath spent a total of 36 years with the Marines and attained the rank of Major General of the Marine Corps Reserve. In 1994, Ann, his wife of 50 years, died of leukemia. McMath married a third time in 1996 to artist Betty Dorch Russell. Today, Sid McMath continues to be an active speaker and counsel to young people wanting to enter law, the military, or politics.
You know, I think you would agree with me in saying that first they have to have a motive, the right motivation, their passion to accomplish something, that they're willing to go in and pay the price of being a politician.
And there's a
the
price
cost
to
of
pay.
it in order to accomplish that one thing.
There's a price.
And
to
you're
pay.
willing to fight for that, whether or not at the time it might be the politically correct thing to do. There's a quotation somewhere in my mind. It goes about motivation, if I can remember it. The right motive gives pinions to thought and freedom and strength to speech and action. They have the right motive, otherwise don't get in.
Governor McMath, let me say that this state is better off today because of you, sir, and what an honor it has been for me to have visited with you during this program on AETN. We're just very, very proud that this is first in a series, and we couldn't have gone any higher to begin and to inaugurate this series.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, sir.
I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Right.